The rain was a relentless percussion against the windshield as Margot Bellamy coaxed her vintage Volkswagen up the long, winding gravel driveway. She was 2 hours behind schedule. The funeral, which she had pointedly missed, had been the previous day, a Tuesday spent dutifully shelving returned library books and patiently assisting Mrs. Patterson in her quest for large-print mysteries. Her father, Harold Bellamy, a titan of the shipping industry and a man consumed by his work, wouldn't have registered her absence. In truth, he'd barely acknowledged her existence for the better part of 2 decades. The Bellamy estate loomed before her, a stark, Gothic monument to inherited wealth and long-nurtured resentments. Margot cut the engine and sat for a moment, watching the rain create intricate patterns on the glass. She'd received the terse, impersonal message from Theodore Pembroke, her father's longtime attorney, at 7 that morning. Presence required at will reading, 10 a.m. sharp. Do not be late. She was late, predictably. She was always late to the events that held significance for the Bellamy family. Margot grabbed her well-worn satchel and made a dash for the house through the downpour. Before she could even raise her hand to knock, the massive oak door swung inward. Theodore Pembroke stood in the doorway, his silver beard meticulously groomed, his expression unreadable behind the glint of his wire-rimmed spectacles. "Miss Bellamy," he intoned, his voice carrying the unmistakable weight of decades spent navigating the intricacies of the legal system. "We've been expecting you." "I'm sorry," she mumbled. "The traffic." He turned and walked away without waiting for her explanation. The library was exactly as Margot remembered it from her infrequent childhood visits. All somber, dark wood paneling and imposing leather-bound books that gathered dust unread. Seated in the high-backed chairs were the usual cast of characters. Her stepmother, Patricia, was dabbing delicately at perfectly dry eyes with a lace handkerchief. Uncle Desmond, Harold's perpetually impatient younger brother, was surreptitiously checking his phone. And then there was Victoria. Victoria Bellamy sat with an air of regal entitlement, her designer suit undoubtedly costing more than Margot's entire monthly salary. At 35, Victoria embodied everything Margot wasn't. Polished, self-assured, and utterly ruthless. She was Patricia's daughter from a previous marriage, adopted by Harold when Margot was 12 years old. From that day forward, Margot had gradually faded into the background, becoming virtually invisible. "How kind of you to join us, Margot," Victoria said, her smile as sharp and brittle as cut glass. "We were just remarking on how Father always emphasized that punctuality is a sign of respect." Margot slipped into the only remaining empty chair, acutely conscious of her damp, slightly shapeless cardigan and scuffed shoes. "I had work at the library," Margot offered lamely. "How quaint," Victoria said, drawing out the word as if it described a particularly unpleasant disease. "Ladies," Theodore interjected smoothly, settling himself behind the massive mahogany desk. He opened a leather portfolio with slow, deliberate movements. "Shall we proceed?" The reading of the will unfolded exactly as Margot had anticipated. Uncle Desmond received a substantial trust fund, ensuring his continued comfort and leisure. Patricia inherited the elegant London townhouse and a generous lifetime stipend. Victoria, predictably, inherited the lion's share, Bellamy Maritime Holdings, the shipping company, worth an estimated £300 million, along with the family's extensive investment portfolio and a sprawling collection of properties scattered across Europe. Margot waited, her stomach churning with a familiar mix of anticipation and dread, for her name to be mentioned. When Theodore finally spoke it, she could feel everyone's eyes swing in her direction. "And to my daughter, Margot Elizabeth Bellamy," Theodore read, his voice carefully devoid of any inflection. "I leave the remainder of my estate, including all personal effects, the complete contents of my private study, and the property known as Whitmore House with all furnishings and belongings therein." The silence that followed was heavy, almost suffocating. "Whitmore House." Victoria's voice cracked with disbelief. "That crumbling ruin on the coast? Father hasn't been there in decades." Theodore continued as if she hadn't spoken. "Additionally, Miss Margot Bellamy is to receive the contents of Safety Deposit Box 742 at Gringotts Bank, London, to be accessed privately within 30 days. Margot's mind was reeling. Whitmore House. It was where she'd spent her summers as a child with her mother, before the cancer had taken her. She was 8 years old when they'd left for the last time. Her mother too weak to even climb the stairs. After her mother died, Harold had simply locked it up and never spoken of it again. "This is absurd," Victoria said, standing abruptly, her carefully constructed composure beginning to crumble. "A derelict beach house? That's all she gets?" "The will is clear," Theodore stated flatly. Uncle Desmond snorted derisively. At least Harold had the good sense to leave the real assets to someone competent. Margot felt the familiar sting of dismissal, but beneath it, something else was stirring. A persistent, nagging curiosity. Why Whitmore House? Why now, after all these years? And what could possibly be in that safety deposit box? "If there's nothing else," she said quietly, standing. "Wait." Theodore's hand emerged from the portfolio again, this time holding a small envelope, yellowed with age. "Your father left specific instructions. This is for you alone." Margot took it, feeling the weight of everyone's stares, particularly Victoria's, which burned with suspicion. Outside, the rain had finally stopped. Margot sat in her car, her hands trembling as she opened the envelope. Inside was a single key and a note written in her father's distinctive, angular handwriting. "Margot, forgive me. The truth is in the walls. HB." She stared at the key, its brass worn smooth with age and use, and felt something shift deep within her chest. For 20 years, she'd been the forgotten daughter, the afterthought, the girl who chose books over boardrooms. But her father's final words suggested that she might have been wrong about everything. The forgotten daughter was about to remember. 3 months after the unsettling will reading, Margot stood in the echoing marble halls of the Royal Courts of Justice, feeling like an imposter in her ill-fitting borrowed suit. The truth she had unearthed at Whitmore House had led her here, to this battlefield of legal warfare, where Victoria was wielding their father's immense fortune like a weapon. The lawsuit had arrived 6 weeks earlier. Victoria Bellamy versus Margot Bellamy. Contest of testamentary capacity and undue influence. Victoria was claiming that their father had been mentally incompetent when he drafted his final will, alleging that he had been manipulated by a daughter who had suddenly reappeared after years of deliberate estrangement. It was a lie, of course, but lies backed by enough money had a way of distorting reality, of becoming perceived as truth. "Miss Bellamy?" A woman's voice cut through Margot's spiraling thoughts. "I'm Judge Helena Cross. We'll be convening in courtroom 7. Judge Cross was a formidable presence. In her late 50s, with steel-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that missed absolutely nothing. Margot had researched her thoroughly. Helena Cross had a well-earned reputation for cutting through pretense and despising manipulation. She was their best hope, although Owen Hastings, Victoria's attorney, was a recognized maestro of precisely the kind of manipulation that Judge Cross abhorred. Inside the courtroom, Victoria sat beside Hastings, a carefully crafted portrait of wounded dignity. She was dressed in understated black, expertly playing the role of the grieving daughter who had been unjustly robbed of her rightful inheritance. Hastings, by contrast, was the picture of predatory confidence in his immaculately tailored Seville row suit, his smile practiced and utterly empty. Margot's attorney, a young solicitor named Rebecca Walsh, whom she could barely afford, looked understandably nervous. They were outgunned, and everyone in the room knew it. "All rise," the clerk announced. Judge Cross swept into the courtroom, her black robes billowing dramatically behind her. "Be seated." She fixed Hastings with a steely gaze. "Mr. Hastings, you may present your opening statement." Hastings stood with theatrical grace, surveying the room. "Your Honor, this case concerns a vulnerable elderly man, Harold Bellamy, who, in his final months, was systematically isolated and manipulated by a daughter who had deliberately abandoned him for 2 decades. Miss Margot Bellamy," he said, gesturing toward her with barely concealed contempt, reappeared only when her father's health began to decline, exploiting his loneliness and cognitive decline in order to dramatically alter his will to her own advantage. Margot's hands clenched tightly in her lap. Every word was a calculated dose of poison, designed to undermine her credibility and sway the jury. My client, Victoria Bellamy, devoted herself entirely to her father's care. Hastings continued smoothly. She ran his company, managed his affairs, ensured his comfort and well-being. Yet, she was effectively cut out of the primary inheritance in favor of someone who couldn't even be bothered to attend his funeral. He paused for dramatic effect. We will demonstrate, beyond any reasonable doubt, that Harold Bellamy lacked the necessary testamentary capacity when this will was drafted, and that Miss Margot Bellamy exerted undue influence over him through emotional manipulation and calculated deceit. He sat down, a smug expression of satisfaction radiating from him. Judge Cross turned her attention to Rebecca. Miss Walsh. Rebecca stood, her voice remarkably steadier than Margot would have expected. Your Honor, the evidence will clearly show that Harold Bellamy was of perfectly sound mind when he made his final will, that his wishes were genuine and freely expressed, and that Miss Margot Bellamy had absolutely no contact with her father during the period in question. She met Judge Cross's gaze directly. The truth, Your Honor, is significantly different from the self-serving narrative that Mr. Hastings is attempting to construct. The first day of the trial was brutal. Hastings paraded a succession of witnesses to the stand, each one carefully selected to reinforce his narrative. There were society friends who barely knew Harold, business associates who testified to Victoria's unparalleled competence, and a doctor who spoke at length about Harold's declining health and intermittent confusion. Each carefully crafted testimony painted Margot as a virtual ghost, a shadowy figure who had haunted the fringes of Harold's life, remaining virtually invisible until the prospect of money suddenly materialized. During a brief recess, Victoria cornered Margot in the corridor, her eyes blazing with barely suppressed anger. You should withdraw, she hissed, her voice low and venomous. You're only embarrassing yourself. That house is worthless anyway. Probably costs more to demolish than it's worth. Take £50,000 and disappear back to your books. Why do you care so much about a worthless house? Margot asked quietly, watching her closely. Something flickered in Victoria's eyes. A brief flash of fear? It was quickly masked, replaced by an icy disdain. I don't, Victoria said dismissively. I care about Father's legacy not being tarnished by your pathetic grab for attention. But Margot had seen it, that fleeting moment of genuine fear. Victoria knew something about Whitmore House, something that clearly terrified her. The breakthrough, against all odds, came on day 3. Rebecca called Theodore Pembroke to the witness stand. The elderly attorney had initially seemed reluctant to become involved, citing his professional obligations and the sanctity of attorney-client privilege, but something had clearly changed his mind. Mr. Pembroke, Rebecca began, her voice clear and confident. You were Harold Bellamy's attorney for how many years? 42 years, Theodore replied, his voice surprisingly firm. And you drafted his final will? I did. In your professional opinion, Mr. Pembroke, was Harold Bellamy of sound mind when he gave you the instructions for that will? Theodore looked directly at Judge Cross, his gaze unwavering. Absolutely. In fact, his mind was clearer and more focused in those final months than I had seen it in years. He was determined, purposeful. Hastings leapt to his feet, his face flushed with anger. Objection. Speculation. Overruled, Judge Cross said curtly. Continue, Mr. Pembroke. Harold Bellamy came to my office approximately 8 months before his death, Theodore continued. He brought with him a box of documents, primarily letters, that he said he had recently discovered. He spent over 3 hours explaining to me exactly what he wanted done and, more importantly, why. Theodore paused, taking a deep breath. He was adamant that Margot received Whitmore House. He specifically said, and I quote, My daughter deserves to know the truth, and Victoria must never find it. The courtroom erupted in a cacophony of noise. Hastings was shouting objections, his face contorted with rage. Victoria had gone visibly pale, her carefully applied makeup doing little to conceal her growing distress. Judge Cross's gavel crashed down with the force of thunder. Order! She glared at the attorneys. Mr. Hastings approached the bench. Miss Walsh, you too. During the hushed, whispered conference, Margot felt her heart hammering in her chest. Theodore had just opened a door, revealing a hidden chamber, and she wasn't at all sure they were prepared to walk through it. What truth? What secret had her father so carefully hidden at Whitmore House? When the attorneys returned to their respective tables, Judge Cross's expression was unreadable. Mr. Pembroke, she said, her voice dangerously quiet. These letters you mentioned, do they still exist? They do, Your Honor. They are currently stored in my firm's secure vault. Harold gave me copies for safekeeping, with explicit instructions that they be released to Miss Margot Bellamy only under these specific circumstances. I want them submitted as evidence by tomorrow morning. Judge Cross's gaze swung to Victoria. Miss Victoria Bellamy? Did you know about these letters? Victoria's lawyer was whispering urgently in her ear, but she shook him off impatiently. I have absolutely no idea what he's talking about, Your Honor. My father's illness clearly affected his judgment. That's not what I asked, Judge Cross interrupted, her voice like a shard of ice. Have you been to Whitmore House in the past 6 months? The question hung in the air like a drawn blade. I may have driven past it, Victoria stammered. I was concerned about the property's condition. Your Honor, Rebecca interjected, seizing the opportunity and pulling out her smartphone. I have photographs taken by Miss Margot Bellamy just 3 weeks ago. The locks on Whitmore House had been recently forced. Someone had clearly searched the property extensively, causing significant damage. Margot had discovered the break-in during her first visit to the house. The rooms had been ransacked, floorboards pried up, and even walls had been examined. Someone had been desperately searching for something, and they had been willing to tear the house apart to find it. Judge Cross's expression hardened. This trial is adjourned until Monday morning. Mr. Pembroke, I want those letters on my desk by 9 a.m. sharp. Miss Walsh, file a police report regarding the break-in at Whitmore House. And Miss Victoria Bellamy, her voice could have cut through steel. If I discover that you have tampered with any evidence or interfered with that property in any way, shape, or form, I will hold you in contempt of court. Am I perfectly clear? Yes, Your Honor, Victoria whispered, her face ashen. As the courtroom emptied, Margot caught Theodore's eye. He gave her the slightest of nods, a subtle acknowledgement of their shared alliance, of the long-buried secrets that were about to surface. Outside, Rebecca grabbed Margot's arm, her eyes wide with excitement and apprehension. What's in those letters, Margot? Do you know? Margot thought of the key her father had left her, of the safety deposit box she had nervously opened weeks ago. Inside, she had found a thick bundle of letters in her mother's delicate handwriting, all addressed to Harold but returned unopened, and a worn leather journal filled with her father's anguished confessions. Yes, she knew exactly what was in those letters. They revealed that Victoria wasn't Harold's adopted daughter at all. Patricia had lied about everything. Victoria was, in fact, the daughter of Richard Blackwell, Harold's most ruthless business rival, carefully planted in the Bellamy family to steal valuable industrial secrets and sabotage the company from within. And Whitmore House, the crumbling beach house that Victoria so readily dismissed, contained the irrefutable proof. Documents that Margot's mother had hidden before she died, insurance against Patricia's inevitable manipulations. Harold had discovered the truth far too late, after Victoria had already thoroughly embedded herself within the company. He had spent his final months desperately trying to protect what remained of his legacy, reluctantly leaving Victoria the business she had gained through deception, while ensuring that Margot received something far more valuable: the truth. The letters, Margot said quietly, a sense of grim determination settling over her, are going to change everything. Victoria emerged from the courthouse, her carefully constructed mask of composure finally slipping away. She looked directly at Margot, and her expression was one of pure, unadulterated hatred. The war had truly begun in earnest. The courtroom was silent, the tension palpable, as Judge Helena Cross began to read the letters aloud, each word carefully enunciated. Each sentence was a controlled detonation, methodically destroying the meticulously constructed lie that Victoria Bellamy had lived for the past 23 years. My dearest Harold, Judge Cross read from Margot's mother's elegant script, the letter dated approximately 18 months before her death. I have discovered something terrible about Patricia and her daughter. The documents I found in your study, the Bellamy Maritime Shipping Manifests, the classified port contracts. Victoria has been secretly photographing them. I followed her to a clandestine meeting with Richard Blackwell, your most formidable competitor, your sworn enemy. Harold, they're using us, using our family as pawns in their ruthless game. I have made copies of everything and hidden them at Whitmore House for safekeeping. Please, we must proceed with the utmost caution. Our daughter, Margot, must be protected from this at all costs. Victoria sat frozen in her seat, her expensive facade cracking like fine porcelain. Owen Hastings sat with his head buried in his hands, clearly recognizing the devastating implications of the evidence being presented. Patricia, who had been called as a witness earlier that morning, had already fled the courtroom in tears. Theodore Pembroke had delivered everything, precisely as Harold Bellamy had instructed. The 37 letters, all returned unopened. Harold's journal, meticulously documenting his growing suspicions and eventual discovery of Patricia's treachery. And, most damning of all, bank statements irrefutably showing substantial payments from Blackwell Industries to Patricia's private accounts, payments that dated back more than 25 years. Mr. Hastings, Judge Cross said, her voice like glacial ice. Does your client wish to continue with this contest? Hastings stood slowly, his shoulders slumped with defeat. He glanced at Victoria, who was now trembling uncontrollably, then back at the judge. Your Honor, we respectfully withdraw our petition. A wise choice. Judge Cross's eyes were like flint. Furthermore, I am referring this entire matter to the Crown Prosecution Service. Miss Victoria Bellamy, while industrial espionage falls outside the direct purview of this court, your blatant attempt to defraud Miss Margot Bellamy through false testimony and willful destruction of property most certainly does not. You will be hearing from investigators very soon. Victoria stood on unsteady legs, her face devoid of all color. For just a fleeting moment, she looked directly at Margot, not with hatred anymore, but with something that resembled despair. The carefully constructed life she had built, the false identity she had worn like a suit of armor, was disintegrating before her very eyes. The original will stand, Judge Cross concluded, her voice leaving no room for argument. This court is adjourned. As the courtroom emptied, Rebecca threw her arms around Margot in a spontaneous hug. You won, Margot. You actually won. But Margot felt no sense of triumph, only a hollow, bone-deep exhaustion. She had won her inheritance? Yes. But the price had been the shattering realization that her entire childhood had been a hidden battlefield, a silent war zone that she hadn't even known she was fighting on. Theodore approached, his expression uncharacteristically gentle. Your mother was a truly remarkable woman, Margot. She protected you in the only way she knew how, the only way she could. By hiding the truth, by carefully preserving it for you. Theodore corrected himself. She knew that Patricia would stop at nothing to destroy any incriminating evidence she found. So, she meticulously created a complex puzzle, a hidden trail that only you would be able to follow, concealed in the one place Victoria would never think to look thoroughly. The house filled with your mother's memory. Margot had found it all in the end, just as her mother had intended. Behind a loose brick in the fireplace in her childhood bedroom, she had discovered meticulously kept account ledgers, secretly photographed documents, and even a recorded conversation between Patricia and Richard Blackwell, discussing in detail how to maximize the intelligence that Victoria could gather from within the Bellamy organization. Her mother had been carefully building a case, meticulously planning to expose them all when the cancer had suddenly accelerated, abruptly cutting her life short. She had died protecting Margot from a truth that, she feared, would have destroyed their family even faster. What happens to Victoria now? Margot asked, her voice barely a whisper. The CPS will conduct a thorough investigation. There will likely be charges for fraud, and possibly even espionage, although that case will be significantly more complex and difficult to prove. Theodore paused, choosing his words carefully. Your father's journal suggests that he knew the truth for at least the past 2 years, but he deliberately chose to do nothing. He was, above all else, protecting the company's reputation, trying to prevent a scandal that would have irreparably damaged Bellamy Maritime. I believe his final act, his carefully orchestrated will, was designed to ensure that you, and only you, ultimately received the evidence. So, the choice of what to do with it, of how to use it, became yours alone, not his burden to bear. So, he left me the truth as an inheritance and the freedom to decide what that truth is worth? Theodore nodded slowly. 1 year later, Margot stood in the grand entrance hall of Whitmore House, barely recognizing the place. The crumbling, dilapidated beach house of her childhood had been transformed into something her mother would have absolutely loved. A vibrant, welcoming space, a living memorial to the power of truth and the enduring promise of second chances. The Whitmore Foundation for Literacy and the Arts now occupied the beautifully restored mansion. The library, where Margot had discovered her mother's carefully hidden evidence, now housed a collection of over 10,000 books, all freely available to the local community. Her mother's old art studio had been converted into a bright, inspiring art classroom, filled with natural light. The master bedroom, where her parents had once slept, was now a cozy reading room, complete with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered breathtaking views of the sea. Miss Bellamy? A young woman approached her nervously, clutching a worn notebook. She looked to be about 19, all sharp angles and cautious hope. I'm Nina Ortega. I'm here for the writing residency interview. Margot smiled, remembering the shy, invisible girl she herself had once been, uncertain and overlooked. Please call me Margot. Tell me about your work. Nina nervously pulled out the battered notebook. I write about my neighborhood, about the people I know, about people like my mom who work 3 jobs and still can't seem to catch a break. But I couldn't afford to go to university, so I stock shelves at night and write whenever I can, during my breaks. When I saw your foundation's advertisement, no application fee, no degree required, just submit your writing, I thought, maybe, just maybe, someone would actually read it. I read every word, Margot said softly, her voice filled with genuine warmth. You have a gift, Nina, a truly unique voice. That's precisely why you're here. But there are probably hundreds of other applicants who are much more qualified than me. Qualification isn't necessarily the same thing as talent, Nina, Margot interrupted gently. My mother taught me that. She always believed that the most important voices are often the quietest, the most easily overlooked, and that simply giving someone the space and the opportunity to be heard can change absolutely everything. She handed Nina a folder. 6-month residency, private room, full stipend, no obligations except to write honestly, to write from the heart. The only rule we have here is that you can't doubt yourself. This is a safe place, a sanctuary for truth. Nina's eyes filled with tears, and she struggled to find her voice. Why are you doing this, Miss Bellamy? Margot looked around the room at her mother's house, her house, now everyone's house. Because someone once hid the truth in order to protect me, and someone else ultimately revealed it in order to set me free. Truth is the most valuable inheritance of all, Nina. It's the only thing that's truly worth passing on. Through the large window, she could see the endless expanse of the sea her mother had so dearly loved. Somewhere out there, Victoria was likely rebuilding her shattered life under a new name, attempting to reinvent herself. Patricia was facing multiple charges of fraud, and the once mighty Bellamy Maritime Empire was slowly being dismantled and sold off, its pieces distributed to various charities, as Margot had directed. She had